Okay, dear audience of this Ambassador's lecture, it is my great pleasure to welcome you here in this very nice auditorium. Of course, you are all listening in from a distance, but that is not going to change the fun of today. We are used to these pandemic times, and we are looking forward to yet another great online event. Hopefully one of the last that we have to organize this academic year. So welcome at KU Leuven in this particular session of the Ambassador's Lecture series, where I feel very privileged to be here next to the Agora Learning Center, where we, as of this week again, have a vibrant student community working very hard to study at KU Leuven. But today we are gathered here to welcome Mr. Ambassador Rolf Einar Fife of Norway. He is ambassador to the European Union since January 2016 and was previously ambassador to France and Director General of Legal Affairs at the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs before that appointment. Ambassador Fife has also had diplomatic postings in the Middle East and at the United Nations in New York, in addition to a lengthy experience within international law. He was chief negotiator of Norway for the maritime delimitation with the Russian Federation in the Barents Sea and the Arctic Ocean. He has been an international arbitrator, is an associate member of the Institut de droit international, and is an elected member of the United Nations International Law Commission. With a university education in Oslo, both in law and in Arabic languages, he is of course very much placed to be discussing complexities of global affairs, of global issues, and in particular the legal aspects of that. And because of that, we are very pleased that we could agree on a very appealing title for this talk, Norway and the EU, a special and enduring relationship, with an interesting subtitle also, Why Norway Said No to EU membership, but yes to the internal market and the EEA. We indeed will have the pleasure to listen to thoughts from an international law expert on a topic that is very much related to many of the debates that currently are ongoing. There is not only the specific situation of Norway that we will learn about, but I'm also looking forward to some insights that more generally may also help to define and to discuss the role of Europe versus the EU 27 in a more global perspective. No need to say that the current tensions in the eastern neighborhood of Europe is a very important issue at this very moment. So without further ado, let's move on with the program of today. First, I will pass the floor to Professor Elise Mouwier, who is head of the KU Leuven Institute for European Law, for an academic introduction to the topic. Then follows the talk by Ambassador Fife, and we will continue the session with reflections and remarks by Professor Christa Tobler, who is Professor of European Law at the University of Basel in Switzerland and at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. And the good thing of working this way in a hybrid or virtual format is that there has been no difficulty in connecting to Leiden, no transport needed. So we are very, very happy to have you also with us, Professor Tobler. We will round up this session by a Q&A, as we are used to do. So please prepare your questions and send them through the links that are provided, which will be moderated by Professor Mouwier. But now the word goes to Professor Mouwier for the introduction of the ambassador. Thank you.
Dear Rector, dear Professor Sells, dear Vice Rector, dear Professor Leuven, Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador Fife, dear colleague, dear Professor Tobler, it's a great honor to have been invited to introduce today's session. And I therefore want to thank in particular the rector, the vice rector, as well as the president of the International Policy Council for this invitation. I was asked to give a short introduction. It seems to me that perhaps by way of introduction, what I shall stress is that although Norway is not a member state to the European Union, we have a very special relationship with the European, it has a special relationship with the European Union. To the extent that some aspects of not being a member to the European Union may take less importance than they would for many other third states to the process of European integration. Now, to explain the relationship between the European Union from a European Union perspective and Norway, because I will of course let the perspective of the Norwegian perspective to the ambassador, perhaps I should come back to a few elements on what the European Union is. What is the European Union? What is it therefore that Norway operates alongside with? If I turn back to the European Union treaties, as a good EU lawyer, that's my main activity, isn't it? I see that the essential purpose of the European Union is to create an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. Now, the expression is sometimes mistakenly understood as an appeal for never-ending uniformity within the European Union. It's actually a much more nuanced commitment, ambitious but nuanced, to create together bonds for a peaceful coexistence within the European Union. And this peaceful coexistence within the European Union requires a level of uniformity, for example, in matters of food standards, safety standards, but it also has to tolerate diversity. And to give an example of this diversity, which we sometimes perhaps forget, let me give the example of Ireland. Ireland is a member state of the European Union, but it is not a member state of the Schengen area. In other words, any of us traveling today to Ireland would have to go through a migration check. As we will hear from the ambassador in a few minutes, Norway is not a member state of the European Union, but it is a member of the Schengen area. So the picture is actually perhaps more complex than just looking at membership or not membership of the European Union. And in fact, being a member of the Schengen area, even if you're not a member state to the EU, means you are guarding the common external borders of the European Union. Common borders which may include, for example, borders with Russia, as is the case of Norway and particularly topical today. Now, the European Union, therefore, has ambitious objectives, creating a common future together in Europe. It relies on two important principles: equality between the member states, sincere and loyal cooperation between the member states and between the institutions who organize the coexistence of these states within the framework of the European Union. Now again, even if Norway is not a member state to the European Union, to the extent that it accepts a number of policies of the European Union, and even if it is not a co-decider on these policies, once it accepts these policies, it is treated as an equal partner and with a collaboration based on good faith and sincere cooperation. These are the words I am borrowing from the agreement that organizes the European Union relationship with Norway and the other way around. Now, with this ambitious objective, these founding principles, I shall also add that the European Union has evolved over time. The scope of its policies has considerably evolved since its creation. It started as an economic organization with ambitious political goals, but to be achieved through economic integration. In particular, the idea of a common market with the free movement of goods, the free movement of services, the free movement of persons and capital. But it became very clear as from the 1980s, 1990s, that this common market will be upgraded towards more explicitly political objectives. For example, the idea of an area without internal frontiers, which we now know as the Schengen area. The idea of a single currency, the Eurozone. The idea of a common foreign security policy for the European Union. The idea of a common European Union citizenship. As I stand here today speaking in Leuven, I'm a French national, I'm a European citizen, and I feel very much at home here in Leuven. Now again, although Norway is not part of all these policies, it is part of many of them, and not just those that relate to economic integration. For example, as I said earlier, it is part of the Schengen area. It is also a very close friend in the context of the common and foreign security policy of the European Union. Now, what are the main features of the various enlargement processes of the European Union to which Norway has not taken part, or which have not led to Norway becoming a member state of the European Union? Well, the story is well known. We started with 6 member states, we today have 27. And we also know that one of these, we lost one member state just a few months ago, the United Kingdom. Now, just 2 brief remarks. Well, importantly, the member states of the European Union are members of their own will, right? The other participating states must agree, but first of all, they must want, a third state must want to be part of the club. The Norwegian people were asked on a couple of occasions in the context of referenda, to which perhaps the ambassador will want to come back, and they decided against accession by Norway to the European Union. It's interesting to keep in mind, however, that that didn't prevent Norway from engaging in further collaboration and cooperation at European level. And the reason I want to insist is that in the 1960s, alongside the European, what is known today as the European Union, another organization developed in Europe to enhance and deepen economic ties between the participating states. It is known today as the European Free Trade Association. This European Free Trade Association, to which Norway is a party, has been coexisting and flourishing alongside the European Union and has important consequences on membership to the European Union, in the sense that many members of the EFTA have left EFTA to become members of the European Union. For example, in 1995, Austria, Finland, Sweden decided to join the European Union, but Norway did not. Did this mean that Norway turned its back completely to the European Union? Not quite. Because as a member of the European Free Trade Association, alongside Iceland and Liechtenstein, Norway decided to develop a closer relationship with the European Union in the context of what is known today as the European Economic Area. And indeed, this European Economic Area allows us today to share an internal market with Norway, to be part of the same Schengen area for those EU member states who are part of the Schengen area alongside, for example, Norway, as well as a number of other types of cooperation. And I mentioned before the common foreign security policy on which the EU and Norway are often aligned. And in particular, in 2021, it was agreed that Norway, together with Canada and the United States, would be, and member states of the European Union, would be part of a military mobility partnership program. Therefore, Norway is a very special partner for the European Union. It jumps in, it is part of many of European Union policies, but it also may contribute to the development of the European Union, perhaps in unexpected ways. Some of these may relate to political alignment. And here I want to give perhaps the example, an example that impacts some member states of the European Union in particular. Over the summer 2021, the Norwegian authorities, alongside Liechtenstein and Iceland, decided to suspend the payment of funds that were intended to support, among other things, civil society and minority rights in Hungary. The reason for this suspension of these special funds was that there were concerns that the authorities administering the funds in Hungary would not be fully independent. Well, in withholding these funds, Norway, alongside the other EEA states, the states of the European Economic Area, were doing nothing but to act alongside European Union institutions in expressing concerns on the protection of values within the European Union, within a member state of the European Union. Norway, therefore, has a very close relationship with the European Union, and I believe that as an EU lawyer, I have a lot to learn from our colleagues. I'm therefore very, very pleased, Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador Fife, that you have accepted to be here this evening, and I look very much forward to your explanations on how further you understand the interplay and the benefits that that the European Union can gain from this close collaboration. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank Rector Luxels and Vice Rector Professor Peter Levens, the head of the Institute for European Law, Professor Elise Muir, who just heard, and thank you for a marvelous and thought-provoking introduction. I would also like to thank the whole academic community of KU Leuven, including outstanding international law experts such as Professor Jan Wouters, and all of them for the kind invitation to participate in this discussion with you. And it is indeed an honor to be invited to this series of ambassadors' lectures in a university steeped in such strong academic traditions over so many centuries in the center of Europe. I have been invited to provide background, as you referred to Professor Muir, on the relations between Norway and the European Union. And I look forward also to exchange with Professor Tobler from Leuven, and I'm honored by her presence virtually. It was also suggested to me, a little bluntly, but maybe in the best academic tradition, to try to explain why Norway said no to membership in the European Union, but yes to the internal market and the EEA. Well, the shortest possible answer to this question is that the way our relationship with the Union is structured rests on democratic choices. You refer to them, Professor Muir. Some facts are familiar to you. We had 2 referendums. In 1972, Norway said no to membership in the communities with a majority of 53.5% against 46.5%. And 22 years later, in 1994, this result was upheld with a slightly narrower margin of 52.2% against 47.8%. As you referred to, Professor Muir, Norway had by 1994 joined the European Economic Area and later Schengen, and a number of other legal arrangements and cooperative frameworks with the EU. And my main point today will be, my main proposition will be that further scrutiny will reveal that Norway can be counted upon as a good European, sharing with the Union fundamental values, common interests, mutual trust, and close cooperation. And I could just also refer briefly to the fact that we have a new government in Norway after general elections that were held last autumn. And the party coalition platform for the new Norwegian government, constituted in October last year, clearly stressed the continued importance of the EEA and Schengen as a firm basis of our cooperation with the EU. It underlined the importance of our partnership to attain our climate targets and of a strategic industrial partnership to promote a green and digital shifts. And the government will actively work to promote Norwegian interests within this legal framework. And particular scrutiny will be devoted to national controls as regards Norwegian labor relations, the energy sector and railway sector. And moreover, the government will carry out an assessment of our EEA cooperation during the last 10 years. And in doing so, we'll also consider the experience of other close partners outside of the EU who have chosen alternative arrangements with the EU. But the basic message is that the continuing importance of the EEA and Schengen are fundamental to us. Now, there is a wealth of academic literature, political analysis, not least debate on European integration and cooperation, also in Norway. And I will not even attempt to delve into all those debates. They are pretty rich and they need to be studied carefully. What I will instead try to do, to the best of my abilities, is to draw on some, in my view, possibly lesser known aspects, or key structuring features, I would call them, that merit to be taken into account when considering this very particular relationship between Norway and the EU that you referred to, Professor Muir. I believe indeed this is a special and enduring relationship in a world of global challenges. I will put an emphasis on the global challenges relating to climate, you alluded to it, geopolitics, and momentous developments, other developments that affect our common pursuit of peace, sustainable development, and justice. In attempting to do so, my remarks will focus or delve into 3 questions. The first one is, what can we draw from Norway's geography and history? That's the first question. The second is, what should we know about European Economic Area, the EEA, which has such a strong structuring importance for our relations? And third, in light not least of global challenges we are all facing, is the cooperation you alluded to between Norway and the EU mutually beneficial? And if so, why? So the first question was, what can we draw from Norway's geographical setting and history? There is an aphorism that has been attributed to Napoleon: to know a state's geography is also to understand its foreign policy. Un État fait la politique de sa géographie. It is frequently invoked in geopolitical analysis. Let us briefly recall then some fundamental factors. We have a population of 5.4 million. And at the same time, we cover a vast territory of 385,000 square kilometers. The population is scattered along a lengthy mainland coastline and a number of islands. Significant responsibilities include resource management in more than 2 million square kilometers of maritime space. I should immediately note 4 key features which strike me as important. Low demographic density, high decentralization, significant social cohesion, and a large degree of trust in public institutions. One could also add to that, if one looks more carefully into our processes, a strong and constructive system for collective bargaining between employers and trade unions, which is an essential part of our society built over almost 90 years and essential to the green shift, the digital shift, and fundamental processes in our society. There are some very particular aspects concerning Norwegian geography which are not always well known. Thanks to the Gulf Stream and the marine ramifications of the Gulf Stream warming up our coasts, these coasts are overwhelmingly ice-free and therefore uniquely accessible. And if you compare with other Arctic territories at the same latitude, a totally different history because of that. Those other Arctic territories are only now contemplating momentous new possibilities of navigation and economic activities. Now consider this fact that almost 500,000 people, 480,000 inhabitants, permanently reside north of the Arctic Circle in Norway. So to us, this is an integral part of our reality, the context in which we live. The Arctic is not something exotic. Our economy, our security, our welfare, also the importance of Schengen you alluded to, all of that, have for a long time been intimately linked to this reality. One might therefore maybe speak in the future of Arctic in the plural when referring today to differing realities in this vast Arctic region. I'd like to add something which one always tends to take for granted, but which one forgets, that distances mean something to people, they mean something to businesses, they mean something to governance. Now, Norway and Sweden share one of the oldest and longest land borders in Schengen, a length of amazing 1,630 kilometers, with very few natural barriers. If you add to that the lengthy border with Finland, further north, you gain an intuitive understanding of the importance of the early establishment of the Nordic Passport Union. What is that? That was a system of open borders between the Nordic countries that was built in stages, starting in 1952, and in fact quite parallel to the experience you have in the Benelux countries. You were pioneers in the field of open borders between yourselves. What they refer to is also gives you an immediate intuitive understanding of the importance of this simultaneous entry into operational force of the Schengen area for the 5 Nordic countries in March 2001. Moving further north to northeast, and you alluded to it, Professor Muir, Norway shares a land border with the Russian Federation also. It is 196 kilometers long. It also represents the outer border of Schengen and of NATO. You could say it's therefore, and it is therefore, in reality also your border, your external border. You can add to that the maritime boundary with Russia for the continental shelf and the 20-mile zones that was agreed in 2010. It has a length of 1,750 kilometers. What is the point in referring to those data, not to require to remember the numbers of kilometers, but to grasp the order of magnitudes which are important for governance, for management responsibilities, and for Norwegian history, and therefore also for our links to Europe. The length of the border with Sweden we have, the land border, is comparable to the length of the maritime boundary with Russia. If you start from Leuven, this is about the same distance as if you go to Minsk from here. You have to cross through a large part of Belgium, the whole breadth of Germany and Poland, and the sizable part of Belarus. So imagine those elements in Norwegian history which have had a huge importance. The very name Norway, what does it mean? It's the way to the north. It's a passage to the north. It's not considered historically to be a passage over land. Imagine steep, numerous mountains, fjords, islands, long distances, climate variations, periodic freezing, low population density. Let's put it bluntly, infrastructure for transport over land in Norway has never been easy. Nothing to compare with planning transport infrastructure in the countryside surrounding Leuven. The passage to the north was maritime. A unique economic and social interdependence between land, the fringe of islands around the coast, known in Norwegian as the skärgård, and the sea. All of those recognized as very particular features by the International Court of Justice. The law comes into play in 1951. In many cases, look at the social factors linked to this. The exercise of professional activities would also depend on the season. Traditionally, sea fishing might be the main activity, while farming would go on during a brief agricultural season, and the farmer-fisher combination of roles is actually well known in Norway. We also have a rich history of unions in Norway. We have an early territorial definition of the Kingdom of Norway, but we have, since the 14th century, had close contact with our neighbors in Scandinavia through different sorts of unions. I will not go through them all, but just imagine that between 1814 and 1844, the Norwegian Prime Minister had to shuttle between Stockholm and Christiania, the name of Oslo at the time. And it was a huge advantage for the Norwegian Prime Minister to know French, because the king, former general rival of Napoleon, Karl Johan Bernadotte, spoke French, and it was important to have the king's ear. So Norway is not a recent or young invention. We have a distinctive sense of territorial identity, closely linked to a very particular position as a coastal state, and a mountainous back country. You can imagine, when referring to the two referendums in 1972 and 1994, that both agriculture and fisheries management were sensitive factors, which played an important role in campaigns and also played a role in the closely contested votes we have referred to. Remember also that it's largely forgotten today that prior to the first referendum, the exceedingly important herring stock almost disappeared. That was a major collapse for our coastal populations, leading to the need for strict measures to rebuild these stocks. And prior to the second referendum, late 1980s, the situation for the North Sea East Arctic cod stock had become critical. Now, both stocks have since been successfully restored through careful, strict management measures, some would say draconian measures, which have been very effective. So that adds a dimension for understanding some of the key sensitivities and also priorities in Norway because of our geography and history, paramount importance of oceans management. Imagine for a moment that there are no less than 1,100, that is 1,100 people currently employed by the Norwegian Institute of Marine Research. I won't bother you with figures again, but imagine a Coast Guard which has very substantial resources. And we have also had, over decades, developed a very successful fisheries management cooperation with Russia in the Barents Sea, which has successfully passed all tests of sustainability, in spite of, from time to time, geopolitical tensions, including the Cold War. The maritime sectors, shipping, fisheries, offshore hydrocarbons, and now, for the future, offshore wind, They have been structuring large parts of Norwegian economy and society. You may also be familiar with the fact that we have a sovereign wealth fund that was created on the basis of resource rent taxation on income from offshore hydrocarbons, in addition to early CO2 taxation and tight budgetary discipline. So that fund has multi-generational perspective and independent mandate, together with strict ethical guidelines for its investments. It cannot invest in Norway in order to avoid inflationary effects for us. It is heavily invested in the European Union. Now, I'm now coming over to the EEA and what is actually the subject of the topic today. I should add that we have a land-based industrial sector and a variety of key services that have always depended heavily on open trade, a level playing field, and a strong wish in the Norwegian population to promote multilateral rules and institutions. So if you add all those factors, including strong educational and research ties with our neighbors, our direct neighbors and beyond, all of those have contributed to Norway's international orientation, with particular economic and other ties with Europe. You referred, Professor Muir, to the fact that basically in addition to our being among the founding members of NATO in 1949, we also have extremely close relations with the European Union. You alluded to the fact that we participate in structured cooperation, PESCO, military mobility, but also we are associated with the European Defence Agency and the European Defence Fund. And we have a huge degree of similar views on key issues that affect peace and security internationally, as well as the importance of upholding a multilateral world order, which is to the benefit of us all. And that brings me now to what has largely structured today's Norway's active participation for more than 25 years in EU's internal market. That is the European Economic Area Agreement of 1992. It does not cover fishery or agricultural policies. It did not establish free trade in these two sectors, but it extends the internal market to us. So what should we know about the EEA? Formally, it consists in a main agreement with 129 articles. That looks like a pretty classic international agreement. But in addition, you have 22 annexes containing references, and ample references to EU secondary legislation, plus 49 protocols regulating particular matters. So I won't delve into all of those, but just say that if you take the total volume of the instruments included in the EEA agreement, or depending upon it, this becomes the largest international agreement to which Norway has ever become a party. And it develops practically on a monthly basis through decisions taken in the EEA Joint Committee by the EU on one side and Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway on the other side. So what happens is a constant updating and additions to the contents of the 22 annexes. So what is the purpose of the EEA? It establishes a single market between the European Union and those three states. It creates, and I quote from the agreement, equal conditions of competition and respect for the same rules. A key purpose is the homogeneous European economic area. Why? To guarantee legal security and homogeneity of the EEA. So it covers the four indivisible freedoms, liberties of movement for goods, persons, services and capital, competition. But then you have lots of rule books which actually have to do with protection of the environment, food security, animal health, transports, coordination of social security, etc. And it is little known that the EEA agreement also allows for adding cooperation on the basis of common agreement to this volume of this treaty body. The key objective is not only to ensure common rules, but to achieve the objective of arriving at as uniform interpretation as possible, what we call legal homogeneity. At the same time, we have to respect our own constitutional requirements for decision-making, surveillance and enforcement. We do that, and that is very particular to the EEA agreement, through a separate second pillar of institutions common to Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway that mirror those of the European Union. As for the European Union, there are therefore international authorities which are independent of member states. I should say maybe first and foremost the surveillance authority, ESA, in Brussels, which actually mirrors somewhat the European Commission, and an independent court in Luxembourg, which mirrors the European Court of Justice. It is called the EFTA Court, but only applies to Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway. Now, this is not to be mixed up with the free trade agreement. I think it's something of a totally different nature. The EA is characterized, and I'm now quoting from the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice and or the EFTA Court, but the EA is characterized by the creation of one internal market, the protection of the rights of individuals and economic operators, and an institutional framework providing for effective surveillance and judicial review. So it's not just an issue of having common rules, but we want to make sure that those are applied and the surveillance be credible so that people can build on mutual trust and expect that those standards will be upheld. Now, it's interesting to see that the EA agreement has to be interpreted also in light of fundamental rights. And the surveillance authority ESA has intervened before the European Court of Justice in cases concerning rule of law, independence of judiciaries in Europe. Why? Well, because the EEA as such, the internal market, depends on the fundamental mutual trust that courts will be independent and be able to dialogue. So to say that this is a mere area of free trade overlooks a lot of things. It overlooks the amount of work, incessant communication between institutions, between the EU and the free states, and among those free states, and within those free states. So this is an ecosystem which makes it possible for our citizens and businesses to consider the EA area as an extension of our own domestic markets, and vice versa, with effective access to justice and predictability. As EU member states, national authorities and courts have an essential role to play. Please consider also that the surveillance authority is supported by a staff of 70, the college is supported by a staff of 70, with 17 nationalities. And they include a large number of nationals of EU member states in that surveillance authority. And they communicate well with the Commission. Now, there's been a lot of debate around European integration, among other things in connection with Brexit. I think one of the big discussions that have emerged is that, or there is a fundamental understanding that states have to make a choice. Either you become an equal partner within an internal market, or you choose to trade with it from the outside. That's the basic dichotomy, if you think in terms of legal categorizations of the approach. So think of the issues here where you don't only have norms, you also have institutions. And it's the interplay between norms and institutions, between a common rule book and the ecosystem of institutions that basically from day to day handle those issues. I would also pay tribute to the important services rendered by the EFTA Secretariat in Brussels, which serve the free states in making sure that the procedures on a monthly basis be totally in conformity with the calendar. And I should like to say that because of this system, in the words of the European Court of Justice, in this regard, parties to the EA agreement are in fact, and I quote, third states that may be assimilated to a member states of the European Union in these contexts. Legal homogeneity does not imply identical means or legal orders. I mentioned the fact that we have our own constitutional requirements, so basically every month we have to take decisions as to whether we will take on board new European legislation. So that is being scrutinized. And the EA agreement is pretty interesting in that it refers to a number of prerequisites which are meant to, in fact, preserve the autonomy of EU law on the one hand, but also the constitutional requirements of the free EEA states on the EFTA side. I should also note a couple of things which are not necessarily widely known. The EEA cooperation allows for a lot of flexibility as regards the possibility of enlarging areas of cooperation on the basis of mutual consent. This has been phenomenally important when it comes to climate. We have decided to align ourselves, Norway has, with regard to the approach to complying making possible or attaining the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate, and are following carefully what the EU does. And we use also the single market to get closer and closer to that goal. You may ask now, what I have referred to, is it reasonable to ask whether the wording of the agreement, in spite of the nice words, emphasis of reciprocity, mutual consideration, is it not in reality only a one-way or unilateral rule-taking without any means of exercising influence? I'd like to spend a couple of minutes on that. I should distinguish here between 3 stages in processes relating to initiatives of the European Union which may have an impact on the internal market. The first one is decision shaping, the second is decision making, and the third is decision taking. Now, you refer to it, Professor Muir, Norway is indeed not represented in decision-making the Council or the European Parliament. However, an often overlooked aspect is the right of participation with possibility of input at the early stage of information and elaboration of projected legislation by the Commission. So the EA agreement gives our experts the equal right to participate upstream, so to speak, on a par with the experts of the EU member states to those processes, and to therefore be associated with working groups and committees. Imagine that before the pandemic, let's put it under normal circumstances, my colleagues tell me that on average there would be at least one expert from Norway, coming from Norway, to cover working groups or committee work concerning pollution matters in Brussels, coming from various expert bodies in Norway. Could be air pollution, marine pollution, other things. So there is an enormous amount of upstream of cross-fertilization and input, which will, of course will depend on the level of engagement our authorities and our experts will devote to this. Another point is that the EA agreement also provides for possibility of participation under already agreed basic terms in EU programs. We don't need a new framework agreement. We basically have clarity as to possibilities of participation, modalities of cooperation, financing. And that's the basis for Norway currently participating in 11 major EU programs, including Horizon Europe, which is so essential to us all. There's lots of more I could say, but I think time is running. So the final question I would like to broach is, in light of global challenges, is this cooperation mutually beneficial to Norway and the EU? Let me just say that various polls have shown now over time that the EA agreement enjoys broad support in Norwegian public opinion. I think it's fair to say that it's ascertained over more than 25 years we've had of existence or entry or this agreement system being in force. The degree of cooperation is quite phenomenal, and you alluded to it, Professor Muir. We could devote more time to that during question and answers, and I'm sure Professor Torbeler may have things to add to this. But I think it's absolutely essential to see that the main challenges that facing Europe now have very often, more often than not, global origins. They stem from climate issues, geopolitical tensions, digital developments, which are momentous. And you will see that in all those areas, Norway, and I think I can let you intuitively understand that Iceland and Liechtenstein are in the same boat as us. We consider the cooperation with the EU to be part of our strategy for promoting this common pursuit. That's why we are, Norway since 2008 participated in the EU emissions trading system, the EU ETS. Since 2019 we agreed to basically incorporate other key pieces of EU legislation relating to climate, the effort sharing regulation, the land use change and forestry, and the list is lengthy. So I would basically now get to closure here and say that I sometimes hear that the equal partnership in the internal markets is in reality a one-way street for Norway, that we benefit from it. I think that would be to overlook the benefits, trade investments, education research, cross-fertilization, in a number of societal activities. If you look at our contributions in the energy union, they're pretty phenomenal. If you look at the way we share knowledge with regards to sustainable waste management, it's quite important. Our own outer space infrastructure is largely put at use for Galileo, Copernicus, and a variety of other essential frameworks. Now, when it comes to trade, I'm struck by the fact that very often traditional trade statistics do not translate clearly the actual flows and importance of value chains. Take aircraft. Because of our geography, Norway, say, has a strong demand for aircraft, both for domestic and foreign connections. So we buy lots of aircraft from Europe. However, the aircraft is very often registered through leasing firms, which are based maybe in new member states. So ownership registration do not reflect the actual use of those aircraft. So I would just say that whether it's with regard to attaining the green objectives we share with regard to transforming our industries, or digitalizing, promoting European resilience, I think you can see that there is a number of elements which make the internal market an asset of great value, and you can count on Norway for cooperating closely. We saw that during the pandemic. I will close by basically stating how important our mutual cooperation support has been through the Union Civil Protection Mechanism, where we cooperated for the repatriation of Europeans, including Norwegian nationals, from all over the world during the COVID pandemic. That is high quality cooperation. It's key to safety of people. Thank you for your attention. Dank u wel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your lecture. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Tobler and to pass her the floor. Thank you very much, Professor Tobler.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm very pleased to participate in this event and to offer a view, so to speak, from the outside of the EEA. I'm giving this talk from the Netherlands, from Leiden, but I am a Swiss national, and as such, I also represent a different perspective. Thank you very much for this interesting lecture, dear Mr. Ambassador, a lecture in which you combined admirably elements from different fields: geography, history, politics, the law, and more. You told us convincingly that many factors together play a role in shaping a country's decision with respect to its participation in international and in European organizations. Talking about the EEA-EFTA states, you made reference to the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, which was also mentioned by my colleague, Professor Muir. It's an organization set up in 1960 as an alternative to the then European communities. These communities were the starting point to the development into today's European Union. Now, Norway is a proud founding member of the EFTA. But different from other founding members, such as Austria, Denmark, Portugal, Sweden, Norway did not decide to move, so to speak, to the other side by joining the European communities and later the EU. You told us, Mr. Ambassador, that there had been 2 negative votes on such membership. That is, democratic choices that shaped Norway's place in the European legal landscape. As a result of these choices, Norway stayed in the EFTA, where to this day it is a member next to its fellow EFTA states, Iceland and Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, which is my country of origin. Now, different from Switzerland, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein decided to join the European Economic Area, the EEA. In fact, the Swiss government was also in favor of joining, and Switzerland had a very notable influence on the negotiations of the EEA agreement. However, this time it was a Swiss democratic choice not to join through a popular vote held in 1992. Since then, the Swiss government has refused to look at the EEA option again, much to my regret, I have to say. Instead, it has negotiated with the EU a complex net of sectoral agreements and more recently has maneuvered Switzerland into a difficult spot where we have even lost our previous privileged access to some particularly important EU programs, such as the Erasmus Student Exchange and the Horizon Research programs. So it is with a certain envy that I hear Ambassador Fife speak about the EEA and what it means for Norway. And also to hear that the present Norwegian government stands firmly behind EEA membership. Interestingly, the government plans to make an assessment of the EEA cooperation during the past 10 years, including also a comparative assessment of the experience of close partners outside the EU, which have chosen alternative agreements with the EU. Presumably, this is where countries like Switzerland or the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland will come in. Now, the ambassador spoke eloquently of the many practical advantages of the EEA system, such as avoiding doubts to conformity, skipping complex procedures, avoiding high financial costs, advantages that flow from being within the field of application of the EEA agreement, from being assimilated to a member state of the EU in the framework of a very privileged relationship. In my following comments, allow me to take up 3 issues touched upon by the ambassador in this context. I will begin with something very practical, namely EEA cooperation during the pandemic. I will then briefly turn to a legal issue, namely the participation of the EEA EFTA states in the internal market. And my third point will be political, namely the debate around the nature of the EEA as leaving the participating states' sovereignty intact. At the very end, I will close with a personal remark. First, the cooperation during the COVID-19 pandemic. It has been valuable and in fact even essential in various different fields: procurement and distribution of vaccines, and the ongoing response to the pandemic with the exchange of data, experience, and views in relevant fora. In fact, I have myself done some research into the EU relations with non-member states in the context of the pandemic. And I found something interesting. When comparing the EEA EFTA states, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway on the one hand, to Switzerland on the other hand. Whilst the former, through their EEA membership, are included in many COVID-related approaches by the EU, Switzerland often is not. Let me give you some very practical and concrete examples. First, when the EU introduced temporary export restrictions in relation to COVID-19 vaccines, it exempted the EEA EFTA states from these restrictions, but not Switzerland. So the EEA EFTA states were better off. Second, when the EU introduced a so-called traffic light system, that is a map with colors indicating the state of the pandemic in Europe, it did include the EEA EFTA states, but it excluded Switzerland. To this day, if you look at the map on the website of the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, you will see Switzerland as a white hole in the European continental map. And the third example, when the EU introduced the COVID-19 certificate, this system also included the EEA EFTA states. Conversely, Switzerland and the EU developed their respective certificates separately. And Switzerland had to take extra steps on a technical level to ensure that its certificate was equivalent to that of the EU. Subsequently, both sides had to take legal steps in order to ensure that the equivalence of their systems was mutually recognized. In fact, only the combination of all these extra steps makes it possible in my case that I can use my Swiss certificate also here in the Netherlands, or if I am able to come to Leuven in your country, Belgium. Actually, the EU and Switzerland work together very well in this respect, but still it was a complex and time-consuming matter. So I would definitely agree with the ambassador in concluding from this example that being a member of the EEA has decided advantages. let me turn to my second issue, the legal one. It's about the internal market. The ambassador told us quite rightly that the EEA is part of an ecosystem of norms and institutions that work in conjunction with a common rule book. He said there is a difference between being an equal partner in the single market and trading from the outside with it. He's quite right. Being an EEA EFTA state means that the EU's internal or single market is extended to the EEA EFTA states and vice versa. And indeed, this concerns all four freedoms, which Professor Muir also mentioned: the free movement of goods, persons, services, and capital, plus the competition law that goes with this, and an institutional arrangement that is intended to secure homogeneity of EEA law with the EU from which it is derived. Now, the EU in this context likes to refer to the indivisibility of the four freedoms. For example, the European Commission, which is an important institution of the EU, hammered on this indivisibility when negotiating with the United Kingdom a new agreement for the time after Brexit and after the transitional period foreseen in the so-called withdrawal agreement. The Commission said to the UK time and time again that in a new trade arrangement, it would not be possible to pick only some aspects of the internal market. For example, to get the free movement of goods, services, and capital only without the free movement of persons. Either it would be all four or none of them, meaning that in the latter case, there would have to be trading from without the internal market. Interestingly, the issue of the indivisibility was also taken up in academic writing. For example, in one of the leading academic journals in the field of EU law, the Common Market Law Review, which is co-edited at Leiden University, where I am at present. Here, an editorial piece went so far as to argue that the indivisibility of the internal market and its four freedoms is a legal principle rather than merely a political goal of the EU. And as such, it must be adhered to and cannot be deviated from. Coming from Switzerland, I must say that I disagree with this view as expressed in the Common Market Law Review. In fact, the political institutions of the EU, among them not least the Commission, have stated many times over the past years that Switzerland too belongs to this inner circle of countries to whom the EU's internal market is extended. And that is so even though here the sectoral agreements concluded by the EU and Switzerland cover only parts of 3 of the 4 freedoms. So, as a matter of political and legal practice, we have here a system that has grown over time and that does indeed cover only parts of the internal market. There have been discussions and negotiations over the past years over new institutional rules in order to achieve more homogeneity. But never has the Commission suggested that the system of sectoral agreements must be extended to cover all 4 freedoms between Switzerland and the EU. So here my conclusion would be that yes, Norway, through the EEA, enjoys a very privileged access to the internal market with its full 4 freedoms. But personally, I do not agree that these freedoms are indivisible as a matter of law or even of politics, as evidenced by the Swiss case. This example simply serves to show that matters in reality are even more nuanced and more complicated than one might sometimes think. I come to my third point. Let me turn to the ambassador's reference to jurisprudence from the Court of Justice. The Court of Justice, which said about the EEA that it does not imply any transfer of sovereign rights to the intergovernmental institutions, which the EEA sets up on the side of the EEA EFTA states. In his notes, the ambassador in this context also mentions the preamble of the EEA agreement, its introduction, according to which the EEA agreement, and I quote, does not restrict the decision-making autonomy or the treaty-making power of the contracting parties, subject to the provisions of this agreement and the limitations set by public international law. In other words, here the EEA is contrasted to the EU, which is often emphasized to be of a supranational nature. Now, on this issue, there has been a rather heated political debate, notably outside the EU and in particular, again, in Switzerland and in the UK. The legal fact is that, according to the preamble of the EEA agreement, the decision-making autonomy of the contracting parties is indeed limited by being subject to the provisions of the agreement, as of course is the case for any agreement one enters into. In this case, however, it goes far. For example, the EFTA Surveillance Authority can go after an EFTA member state, and the EFTA Court can rule that such a state has failed to fulfill its obligations under the EEA agreement. Importantly, on the substantive level, EEA law is a system of association to EU law, where the common rulebook is based on EU law. And this EU law is made by the EU institutions, albeit, we heard it, with important decision-shaping rights of the EEA EFTA states. And by the way, also of Switzerland's in the areas in which it participates in the internal market. In the heated Brexit debate, Brexiteers liked to speak of the EEA EFTA states as rule takers. And in Switzerland, the nationalistic Swiss People's Party argues that getting into an EEA-like system would mean to allow the EU to colonialize Switzerland. On the other side of the political spectrum, the Social Democratic Party has long argued that it would be better for Switzerland to join the EU, thereby increasing its sovereignty by pooling it with that of the other member states, rather than being only associated through treaties that oblige it to follow EU law without giving it any decision-making power. My own view on this matter is pragmatic. Just as in Norway, there is no popular majority in Switzerland for joining the EU. For both countries, the EU is an extremely important trading partner. Much of our economic well-being and many jobs hinge on well-organized relations with the EU. In my view, the EEA represents a valuable compromise that offers the EEA EFTA states a privileged relationship with the EU, short of membership, and therefore with less influence, but close to the EU, with many advantages that flow from such an agreement. Let me finish with a personal remark, which is entirely unlegal and unpolitical, and the relevance of which, in the context of the ambassador's lecture, may not be immediately obvious to you if you do not speak Norwegian. The point is this: I love gardens. When preparing my remarks on the present occasion, I was fascinated to read in the ambassador's notes about the Skjærgård. That is, this particular geographic arrangement of sea, islands, bays, and waterways on the Norwegian coast. Being curious to learn more about this concept of Skjærgård, I did some research into the term, and I found a book entitled Ocean States, Archipelagic Regimes in the Law of the Sea, written by Mohammed Munawar. Here I learned that there are actually more Skjærgårds in the word, be it under other names. However, the Norwegian version is special. In the book, it is described in the following manner. It consists of 120,000 islands, islets, rocks, lies along the whole coast of the mainland. With the Skjærgård, almost every island has its large and its small bays, countless arms of sea, straits, channels, and mere waterways which serve as a means of communication for the local population with inhabitants which inhabit the islands and the coastal region of the mainland. So what about my love for gardens in this context? Being curious of languages, I looked up the meaning of the Norwegian word Skjærgård in the dictionary, and I found it to correspond to the beautiful word of Scherengarten in my native German. in which you can hear the words scheren and the word garden, garten. There's actually no Dutch or English translation I have found. So in the German translation, and thanks to your lecture, Mr. Ambassador, I found a new and very special garden. I have had the privilege of visiting your beautiful country, one of its most spectacular areas, the Lofoten Islands. However, I was then not aware of the term Skärgård and of its broader importance. You told us that geographical imperatives explain a projection of the Norwegian inhabitants towards the sea, and that the special link between the sea and the land, not least in the shape of the Skärgård, explains much of Norway's nature and of its decisions in relation how to deal with its neighbors, not least with the EU. For me personally, the Skärgarten will be a very particular garden to visit in the future. Thank you for telling us about it, and thank you for all the other interesting elements in your lecture. I thank you for your attention.
I'll just say a word of thanks to Professor Tobler. Thank you for your both enlightening comments and not least for your very heartwarming references to the roots of words and common cultural heritage. And I certainly learned a lot through listening to you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Ambassador, Professor Tobler. So I'm very pleased to be receiving already a few questions from our audience online, perhaps across the world even. So let me perhaps start with one of them, which I think you would be both welcome to answer, although I guess this one is perhaps more specifically addressed to Mr. Ambassador. Do Eurosceptic nationalist parties pose a challenge to Norway's position in European institutions or in relation to the European Union?
Thank you very much. I think one of the paramount cross-party issues in Norwegian Parliament and the population at large is the fundamental value of democracy. Democracy as a source of strength, as a source of potential for mobilizing on the basis of knowledge and not fake news, the necessary energy to carry out necessary transitions. One, to save our planet with regard to climate change, but there are a number of other things. So I think that explains the enormous importance Norwegian government puts on issues such as democracy, rule of law. And democracy includes the possibilities of a vibrant civil society to actually shape the public debate on the basis of freedom of expression. So it's not only for authorities, public authorities and government in a European state or elsewhere to set the stage. Civil society has to participate. So I think without thinking of any particular political party or having that in mind, I think there's a very strong push in Norway for cooperating very closely indeed with the European institutions and member states to basically promote the premises for a successful public discourse. Successful in the sense that one doesn't necessarily agree on everything, but one should at least be able to exercise the freedom of expression and mobilize all sectors of society. That's what makes a society more resilient and adaptive to change.
Thank you very much. And here is another question. By all means, Professor Tobler, if you wish to intervene, do feel free to wave at me through the screen, and I would be happy to, if you feel also you want to add something. We have another question here that relates to let's say, the parallel between Norway and the United Kingdom and its limits. So the member of our audience says, well, Norway has proven that it can benefit from the best of both worlds. It benefits from the EU internal market, but it also remains independent and outside of the European Union. Why do you think that Norway has not managed to convince our UK friends from following the example set by your country? Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you so much. With all due respect, I don't think it was up to Norway to basically tell the British people what to do. So we have the most profound respect for democratic choice done by the United Kingdom in this context. And I would be also very, very humble indeed in trying not to draw any direct references or transpose our respective histories and public debates from one particular part of Europe to another, even though we have the very closest ties, including particularly with the United Kingdom. I think it's very much an issue where we have noted that issues of European integration may create a lot of debate. They may actually give rise to passionate debates. We've seen that in Norway in connection with the referendums, for instance. So we have to settle for those legal frameworks which our respective populations decide to have on the basis of democratic choice. So I wouldn't go beyond that, other than say that our ambition is of course to have as close and productive relations all across Europe. And I should add that we're delighted to see how, in the face of geopolitical tensions that are going on right now, both NATO and the European Union are speaking with one voice.
Thank you very much. And I see Professor Tobler would like to add something.
There is a diplomat that chooses very careful language, as he must, obviously. I do not have these inhibitations, and I will therefore say that, in my opinion, Norway has managed to take, very simply, a very pragmatic approach. It has weighed the advantages which it gets out of the EEA agreement against the price it has to pay for that. The price being, to some extent, to have limited influence on the EU law as it develops, EU law that will be relevant for the EEA agreement. In my personal opinion, the choice that Norway has made is a wise choice. It is a useful choice, and I think the experience of Norway does show that it benefits greatly from this arrangement. It remains to be seen what will happen with the UK in the long run. I'm not meaning to say that the EEA is the only possible means of how to organize your relations with the EU in a constructive manner. There are other ways, I'm sure. But I do think that what we have here is an expression of a down-to-earth, pragmatic approach where advantages and disadvantages are weighed. And in my personal opinion, Norway has made a wise decision.
Thank you very much. And I follow up with another question. One of the members of the audience is also saying, well, I'm glad to hear about all the wonderful partnerships we have between the European Union and Norway, for instance, and hope that this will continue. Yet, in the same time, the Norwegian people have said no twice to joining the European Union. So could you perhaps elaborate on what you think are the reasons for these negative votes? It was perhaps a bit introduced already in your presentation, but maybe you want to elaborate further.
Well, thank you very much. I actually studiously avoided trying to give you a fit-all answer to questions that have been very vibrantly discussed in Norwegian political history and in our public debate. What I alluded to was the fact that there were some doubts among, for instance, our fisheries communities as to what would be in the best national interest in terms of rebuilding fish stocks that were absolutely essential for our society along our coasts, and where one had seen overexploitation of fish stocks. I'm not saying that would be was a decisive issue, but I certainly would be amiss if I didn't reflect to the fact that was hotly debated. And certainly this was one of the many issues that were discussed. Of course, there were also issues as to sovereignty and the issues Professor Tobler referred to. That is, irrespective also in if you consider legal arrangements, what degree of actual influence can you play? So that has also been a very open, debate as to whether the standards that are set by the European Union, whether you can influence them from the outside, from the inside, or whether they influence you whatever you do in a sense. There are interesting books that have been written about, for instance, the Brussels effect by Arno Bradford, which goes to show that with regard to a number of issues, those who produce toys for children on other continents will very often follow or base themselves on a compliance with European standards, just to make sure that they can sell wherever, because that would be the sort of entrance tickets to many markets. So that would be an example of an enormous amount of adaptation to some European standards without being part of any decision shaping. So we've had discussions about that. And certainly there are, I shouldn't go too far in trying to debate where we were at those different stages during the referendums. What I see is that there is a huge degree of consensus in Norway, still debates on all kinds of issues, but a huge degree of convergence on the fact that we want to work together with the European Union to face some of the global challenges that we all face and which are quite fundamental. I mean, when it comes to the digital revolutions, whether it has to do with the protection of personal data, whether it has to do with a level playing field for small businesses, whether it has to do with issues that have to do with health. And you referred, Professor Tobler, to the pandemic. Certainly the cooperation we had, you could say very simply put, before the pandemic, we had the celebration with the European Union of the 25 years since the entry into force of the EA agreement. And I noted that on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, there was a huge degree of satisfaction as to if you look at the great picture, it's been a successful cooperation. What has happened since is the pandemic, and I can bear witness to the fact that during the pandemic, those relations have become even closer on a number of issues, and we've seen how whether it's an issue of value chains, making sure that key vital medical equipment reach in time to hospitals, or we share information on the developments relating to the pandemic and reflections around what the best ways to ensure as much liberty of movement and oiling the economic machinery, while at the same time stopping the virus from spreading. All of that has been a learning experience, and I'm pretty sure that our assessment and the assessments and the reviews will take place, but our basic assessment is that the EA agreement and Schengen have been useful to us in terms of added capacity to respond to those challenges.
And if I may ask a follow-up question, and I will give the floor to Professor Tobler as well, is there any further reflection on the possibility or the opportunity of organizing a new referendum? This is also a question we've received on membership.
As an ambassador, I would have to basically refer to my political masters and basically refer to the fact that it's not on the agenda. And we have also a program of work for the current government, which I refer to, which constitutes the political platform for the coalition government we have, which has been very clear on what the key priorities are. And those are urgent priorities. They have to do with climate. They have to do with industrial strategy linked to the green and digital shift, and has to do with basically confronting or facing in a successful way global challenges. So it doesn't say there that they will put on the agenda an issue of a new referendum. But beyond that, I will not, of course, speculate. It would be probably beyond my pay grade.
Thank you very much. Professor Tobler, you wanted to add something, please.
Thank you so much. Yes, I would like to take up what the ambassador said about the Brussels effect, the fact that there is pressure coming in a way on a very practical, factual level from the EU on countries that are not member states of the European Union. We have felt that very, very much in Switzerland. We have actually even invented a term for it that is somewhat euphemistic. When we adapt our Swiss law to EU law, without any legal obligation through a treaty to do so, we like to call this autonomous adaptation. You can question how autonomous it is if you have to do it under pressure from the facts. And as the ambassador said, in that case, you don't have any kind of influence on the legislation. There are no decision-shaping rights. So if you are in the EEA framework, or even in the framework that we have between Switzerland and the European Union, within an agreement, then at least you do play a role in the system. So short of being a member, which for political reasons these countries do not want at the moment, there is this in-between position where you can still have an influence on the legislation that will eventually influence you. That is what I would like to add.
Thank you so much. And I turn perhaps to a more geopolitical question now. One member of our audience is asking, what is the position of Norway in the actual dispute, on the current disputes between Russian and the Western world?
Well, it's relatively easy to answer that because I would just refer to the common positions that have been stated by NATO and European Union in terms of the need to uphold the territorial integrity of states and avoid use of armed force or threat of use of armed force, and refer to the need to conduct dialogue within the multilateral institutions that have been established, and I think quite successfully, in the second part of the 20th century, in order to promote confidence building, promote possibilities of transparency and mutual trust with regard to provision of security, but also, I would say, ensuring respect for rights, human rights, and a number of other values which are also pertinent, they're relevant to security in the long term.
Thank you very much. Indeed, another question then, going back to the European Free Trade Association, which both Mr. Ambassador and Professor Tobler, you referred to. One of the member of our audience is asking, is there any chance that any other countries would join the EFTA in the near future?
The politically correct answer for a diplomat would be you have to ask those countries. But I would like to add that one thing is being a party to the EFTA or a member of EFTA. As Professor Tobler so eloquently referred to, it's EFTA has, for many purposes now, an important role to play in the context of free trade negotiations we carry out very often together with third states on different continents. However, our relations with the European Union, that is Norway's relations with the European Union, don't go through EFTA as an international organization. Rather, they go through the EEA agreement, where there is an EFTA component consisting of the free states we refer to. And one thing is joining EFTA, another thing is joining the EEA. And I think Professor Tobler referred to the fact that there is no sort of, to be a party to the EEA agreement requires a large number of things. There is a set of rights, there is a set of obligations. And I think that in the course of various discussions, for instance, on Brexit, very often, if I'm not mistaken, Michel Barnier, who was the negotiator on behalf of the European Commission, referred very often to a so-called staircase diagram, which was a slide which was used to sort of illustrate in a simplified way, very simplified way, extremely complex rules and institutions. Because I must admit that if you really delve into those international agreements we've been referring to, they require a lot of study, and you're an expert in that, Professor Muir. But if you want to simplify to the extreme, the diagram referred to by Michel Barnier to exemplify or illustrate the various possible relationships the EU was envisaging with third countries that wanted to have a close relationship, referred to the fact that there is a connexity or a connection between rights and obligations, and there was a reference to a pillar or a column which was constituted by the EA states, and that I think also refers to the huge degree of integration we actually have through this ecosystem which I refer to, which in my view is a two-way street, and which works well not only because it's a legal system. I mean, of course, it's based on law, but it's also a communication system. It's a communicative system where on a day-to-day basis, a lot of work is being carried out to both understand, communicate, and understand even better how legislation should be shaped and when it's adopted, how it should be implemented. So I think that's a litmus test for anyone who wants to sort of consider that kind of arrangements, is basically to think of the huge degree of complexity we have in our day-to-day lives, the dependence we have on food safety or issues concerning safety of workers on construction sites. I mean, how lifts work. I mean, there are lots of regulations and there are controls on that. And that is regularly updated, so there's lots of work on that. I sometimes think by analogy of the fact that when I use my computer or my laptop, my smart telephone, I constantly receive messages that I have to upgrade my apps or my different versions. And I think the EA agreement also has an element of that. And a lot of that is not widely known by lots of people. We depend on it. When we understand how new chemicals or new combinations of chemicals work together, and if they may be constituting a hazard for our children or for ourselves, this is being integrated into rules. And on the Norwegian side, I know that we have lots of experts who basically are considering this to be a true contribution to common food safety. And I think Horizon Europe is another example, uniting our research and the university centers of excellence, where Leuven has a fantastic standing, by the way. And I think in our complex world, we have to think of the added knowledge that accrues every day, and which basically influences very quickly, including through the digital shift we're seeing in many sectors of society, automation, and all kinds of other things. This requires some degree of common dialogue and interaction. So the EA agreement is not sort of just a legal instrument which works by itself. It requires a lot of involvement and engagement.
Thank you so much. And I think that in these comments you also partly answer, I believe, a question that was asked by a dear colleague of mine, Professor Van Kalster, also professor here at the Law Faculty. Do you, Mr. Ambassador, feel that Norway has a real impact on the development of EU secondary law, enough to avoid the feeling that the Brussels effect works most strongly vis-à-vis Norway? So, and perhaps you could elaborate a bit more on whether there are specific areas of EU secondary law where you feel that Norway is particularly influential through its expertise, sharing its expertise and its research.
That's a very good question. Thank you very much. And it's a constant question we ask ourselves, because the possibility to participate in decision shaping at the very early stages, where the Commission is basically identifying needs and possibilities, really is very much something which requires our experts, our institutions, our public authorities to consider whether they should engage and how they can be relevant. So the answer to your question will certainly depend on how important the particular issue is considered to be, how aware one is of the potential importance it may have, and also the key question might be, do we have any particular comparative advantages among our various, whether it's scientific research bodies or in our businesses, to try to respond. So one example of area where I know there is a huge input from Norwegian side has to do with food safety when it comes to to seafood. Of course, when it comes to seafood, there is an enormous amount of research being carried out in Norway because of the sheer magnitude of the stakes that we and the issues of relating to health, sustainable development, and continuous improvements in management. And I know that's one example of area where one has a huge input. Another may be relating to energy. As you well imagine, Norway is pretty much involved in energy, whether it's hydropower or issues concerning hydrocarbons. I should say that I'm very proud of the fact that we have tested over time the issue of carbon capture and storage. We know that there are industries in the future, the cement industry is just one example, which in order to continue working will need to have some production of CO2, and how to deal with that. Well, one of the questions is could one safely capture it and store it? And I dare say that an enormous amount of work has been carried out in Norway on that account. We're showing extremely promising results. So I think it's absolutely one important tool in the emerging toolbox in order to be able to face the challenges that the Paris Agreement is constituting for us. So there are examples. There are other examples where I know that the expert bodies in Norway concerned follow extremely closely the discussions, but basically find that the critical mass of opinion in the European Union is such that we can very much align ourselves with it. And Norwegians, being eminently practical people, won't necessarily need to state much in that context. They will just take note of it and try to implement it. Of course, there may be areas where there are particular sensitivities, of course, and that you would have in any society. And I referred in my lecture, and thanks for your patience in listening to me, there are particular issues concerning our geography and the way our society is built around a very particular geography, which entail lots of challenges with regard to, for instance, organization of our railway sector, just to mention one example. So it's important for us to communicate our analyses and views in the best possible way. So I think the answer depends very much on which sector you speak of. And there is a common denominator. It's in terms of decision shaping very much up to us. Of course, the big point that was implicitly referred to in both your introductions is that the EU has developed a lot during those years, where the EEA agreement has remained, you could say, a very reliable set of provisions, which has allowed for a lot of flexibility. But the changes that have taken place on the EU side have required a lot of inter-exchange or work together with you. And I think it's part of the success that one is willing to really consider how to make sure the internal market works on the basis of those different constructions we have.
Thank you very much. And I turn now to perhaps a couple of questions that look at maybe natural resources, let's say. So one of the participants in the audience is asking, how do you foresee the influence of the melting of glaciers on the strategic relationships between Norway and the EU?
I refer to the fact that the Gulf Stream warms up our coasts. So basically, overwhelmingly, you could say that Norwegian coasts are ice-free. So there are no spectacular changes in our immediate vicinity. But of course, far up north, we see more visibly than elsewhere, possibly, the momentous impact of climate change. When we speak of a global average of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius or the like, you have a multiplicating effect in the Arctic. So if you say that you have a global average of, say, 2 degrees temperature increase on average, that means much more in the Arctic, and therefore also enormous consequences in terms of ice melting. And ice caps, whether it's in Greenland ice or the like, or in the Antarctica, have an impact on global climate, among other things. So that is an area where I think we are very much engaged. With regard to our glaciers, yes, I think in the Alps and quite a few other places in the Himalayas, we're witnessing the receding edge of glaciers, And that is ample proof of the fact that things are going very quickly. So I think that explains the cross-sector support in our parliament in favor of doing something very effective to counter climate change. Of course, the political debate is how to share the responsibilities and you could say burdens, if there are some, because those are big societal transformations requiring a lively debate, democratic debate, about what kinds of tools one will use. But what you refer to is basically more motivating effects for Norwegian public opinion and politics, rather than the fact that glaciers receding have an immediate impact. What we have seen, I should add, is much more frequent flooding, as you have seen in Belgium, and much more a higher degree of lack of or less predictability in terms of weather patterns. And that is unsettling to us all. And I think we share that sentiment across Europe and elsewhere.
Thank you so much. And now turning to another natural development, one of the members of the audience is asking, well, what do you say to to those who argue that Norway will join the European Union the day Norway's oil reserves run out? I heard the opposite, so to speak. That is that because one found oil in the North Sea, Norway voted against in 1994. I think that is a misnomer. I think basically, if you look at the deeper currents in the debate, the general debate we had in Norway in the wake of, or in the campaign before actually both referendums, you had issues of values, social values, societal values, and issues of questions of how much can you control your own day-to-day life, in a sense, and your close environment. Please note that distance is also huge in Norway. I referred to that, I think, a couple of times. So between what you could call center and periphery, there's always been an incessant dialogue in Norway, a very important one. So I don't think it's an issue of oil money, which is decisive for Norwegian public opinion. Thank you very much. And I turn to a point that is quite distinct, but that perhaps goes back to some of the elements of the earlier presentation you gave in relation to financial contributions. One member of the audience is asking, are the EEA countries obliged to pay for their access to the internal market, or are EEA grants for reducing social and economic disparities to be considered a voluntary contribution? So perhaps a clarification on the financial contribution associated with membership of the EEA.
Thank you very much for that question. It's a very good one. Let me say that yes, on the one hand, Norway and the other two parties to the agreement on the EFTA side actually cover expenses relating to a number of things, including the running of the institutions in our pillar. Plus, we also pay contributions which have been agreed as to participation in programs such as Horizon Europe. However, there is this frequent misunderstanding that in order to access the internal market, you have to pay some kind of fee. That's not the case. Technically speaking, it's Article 115 of the EEA agreement, which basically states that to the extent that there is a disparity, continuing disparity between social and economic conditions in the European Economic Area, that is in Europe, then Norway or the parties to the EEA agreement may contribute grants which would not go to the EU budget, but could go to beneficiary states. And that would complement what you know very well to be cohesion funding in the EU. So it would be complementary to cohesion funding. And what has been the case, to provide you an illustration, is that one has looked at how the EU cohesion policies have been devised, and one has looked, for instance, at a benchmark, which is which states within the European Union have an average GDP per inhabitant which is lower than 90% of the average in the EU. That's kind of one of the, you could say, key factors for EU cohesion fund, if I'm not totally mistaken. And that has influenced our own approach to that. So as long as there is a need, and that is, I think, an important factor to consider. And we have last year actually conducted on the EU side and on the side of my own country and Iceland and Liechtenstein, need assessments as to whether these we call them EEA and Norway grants, have they actually been useful? That's the key question. You know, it's not just you know, throwing money at something. Does this money have an effect? And the answer is yes. It makes a difference. So we're delighted about that. And the second question is there an improvement or a reduction of social economic disparities within the EU internal market? And the answer is also yes, which is also very encouraging. Do such disparities still exist? The answer is yes, and as long as they do, we will of course have to negotiate on new programming periods for 7 years. Let me say that priorities will be very important. I think it's very important to consider that those mirror key values we have in common, EU and ourselves. Not only relating to green transformation and the like, but I would say, for instance, democracy, civil society, rule of law are emerging even more than before as key factors which we value a lot and which will influence our choices.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Professor Tobler, would you like to add any words before we close this session?
Very briefly on this issue. This is actually a topic that does not only exist within the EEA, but also in relation to the Swiss-EU relationship. And the difference is that in the EEA, the basic framework is established in the EEA agreement. In contrast with Switzerland, a new memorandum of understanding has to be negotiated with the EU every few years. But I quite agree with the ambassador that these payments are meant as cohesion payments, not as an entry fee to the internal market. The confusion about that kind of dispute has to do with the fact that sometimes even exponents of the EU itself, like an advocate general, for example, has stated in an opinion that this is payment for entering the internal market. But this is not the basic idea. The basic idea, as the ambassador said, is cohesion. Cohesion in a market that has been enlarged through the EU enlargement with countries that are weaker economically speaking. I consider it a very fair and only just issue that countries that in that sense are part of the larger construct also contribute on this level.
Thank you so much. Well, I would like to conclude by thanking our audience for their questions, and thanking in particular Professor Tobler, Mr. Ambassador, for your insightful presentation, helping us to better understand the relationship between the European Union and Norway, and Professor Tobler for your thoughtful comments on the parallel with Switzerland and some very topical issues on the difference between being a member of the EEA and not being a member of the EEA as a third state to the EU. Thank you so much. I wish everyone a lovely evening, and our very special guest in particular. Thank you, and we hope to welcome you in Leuven very soon.
Thank you, Professor Muir. Thank you, Vice Rector, and thank you, Professor Tobler, for a very engaging conversation. And thank you to all of you who have put very cogent questions to us. Thank you.